This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Of immigrants, and then the economic policy of the political economy, of immigration policy, which is to a certain extent related to the quality of immigrants. What I'm going to do is present some old problems. I try to convince you that there is a scope to rethink again of these problems and to discuss particularly certain stereotypes that we can find in the literature, particularly regarding to European immigrants to Latin American countries. As I said, I'm going to focus on immigrant quality, and this is a very difficult concept because everybody understands by quality many different things. For economic history and for this purpose, what I'm going to concentrate is on human capital, basically, and to a certain extent on occupation. It's something very difficult to measure, and we can discuss if this is the right approach to grasp a human quality of immigration, but in any case I'm going to try. I'm going to also to talk about assimilation, which is of course related to the quality of migrants. Let me start with very preliminary thoughts. This is the general idea of the purpose of writing this book, is that there is apparently no consensus on what was the effect, the global effect, the aggregate effect of immigration, mass immigration to South American destinations compared particularly with the United States. For the United States, there is this agreement, general agreement found in the literature, that there was that immigration from Europe had a positive effect, particularly on the long-run growth and development of the American economy. So, I mean, one of the first questions is why such a consensus does not exist for the Latin American countries. We can discuss if that was a question of numbers, because, I mean, the majority of European migrants went overwhelmingly to the United States, and very few in relative terms compared to the States when opted for Latin American destinations. I'm not going to discuss this today. We can also discuss that it's because on the long run, the economic performance of Latin American countries, particularly in the 20th century, was not as successful as the United States. I'm not going to discuss that. I mean, that's another part of my project. But the idea I want to discuss today is that if this lack of consensus on the positive impact of immigration in Latin America is because the Latin American countries receive poor, backward, and more ignorant immigrants, I mean particularly vis-a-vis the United States or Canada, or sometimes the comparison is with Australia, particularly in the case of Argentina. So this is the idea for today. I'm not going to talk about all Latin American countries, first of all because it's impossible, and second because the majority of immigrants concentrated in very few countries in a massive way. I'm always talking about the mass migration of the late 19th century, early 20th century. So now I'm going to concentrate particularly on Argentina and Brazil, and from the other side of the Atlantic I'm going to talk mainly three countries of origin, Italy and Spain, particularly in those two countries, and then Portugal. Of course, we know that Latin American countries receive Eastern Europeans and Russians and from Poland. After the First World War, people from the Ottoman Empire in the 1920s. The Germans were a very specific and particularly well-studied group in Brazil, early in time, in the central decades of the 19th century. But I'm going to concentrate today mainly in Argentina. That was the majority of my research is focused on Brazil and Italy and Spain. So there is also one reason to do that is because for Latin American countries, one of the main differences that we can we find when we compare to other destination countries in the so-called New World countries is that there is an homogeneity. It's an homogeneous group from the ethnic composition of migrants. This is the case of Argentina, and you see, the blue size of the graph is Italy and Spain. So, although there are a lot of things that we can say on different migrants group, Eastern Europeans, Russians, Syrians, Lebanese, Jewish, and so on and so forth, the majority of them all over time came from Italy and Spain. And this is exactly the same case from Brazil. The only difference is this blue size of the graph is Italy and Portugal. So the Italians are all over the world, not only in Latin America. And if we compare Argentina and Brazil, we have Italian and Spaniards and Italian and Portuguese. I'm going to divide my talk in mainly two different parts. The first one is discussing this quality of immigrants from the point of view of human capital and from the point of view of assimilation of migrants. And the second one, as I said before, is going to concentrate on the political economy of immigration policy, which is, I'm going to explain later on, related to a certain extent to this question of quality. So let's start with this problem of assimilation of migrants, quality, and what the literature says about that. Here, my starting point is what I call the legacy of the Dillingham Commission. For those of you that are not very familiar with the literature on immigration, the Dillingham Commission in the United States, before First World War, the volumes were published in 1910, reached certain conclusions that, although everybody agrees that they were wrong, particularly when they established that conclusion that the old immigrants were the good ones in terms of assimilation, literacy, performance in the labor market, and so on and so forth. And the new immigrants coming from Southern and Eastern Europe were national groups that poorly assimilated to the American way of life, had a lot of problems, wages were lower, the performance in the labor market were worse in relative terms, and so on and so forth. And that conclusion, although there are a lot strand of literature proving that it's wrong, and there are a lot of the things that we can discuss, but it has percolated all the literature. Even today in any textbook, still you will find the same distinction between the old immigrants in the United States and the new immigrants in the United States, and there is a big therefore, since for the American case, those new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe were considered with lower labor market quality or with more poor and more backward and more ignorant. Therefore, since these immigrants came at the same origins, had the same origins to Latin American destinations, and again I repeat, this is a big therefore Latin American countries receive poorer and more backward immigrants compared with other destination countries. Just between brackets, this picture is entirely reversed when we compare the Italian immigration to the Americas, because the northern Italians were more skilled and more literate, and they went to South America, and Italians from the south were more illiterate and more backwards in relative terms, comparing the two regions within Italy, and they went mainly to the United States. I'm going to discuss very briefly that case in a minute. So from that starting point, what I want to discuss is three main basic points. First of all, as I said before, there is a concentration of origins in the Latin American countries, in Argentina and Brazil. The origins were very much concentrated in Southern Europe, and a priori we could think that those immigrants had, and for the receiving society, there was a certain advantage in having a similar cultural background, all colonial links. This is absolutely obvious for the Spanish case and for the Portuguese case in Brazil. Common language, that's the case for the Spanish all over Latin America, and for the Portuguese in Brazil, and religion. So the starting point would be, well, these Latin American countries receive these migrants from Southern Europe, and there is something positive in having a mass migration from a very similar cultural, religious, and whatever you can put in this cultural box, similar background. Second, I'm going to discuss something that for me is quite obvious because I've been working on this for many years, but for many people it's not, maybe it's not. Immigrants to Latin America were positively selected. So, I mean, there is a discussion going on in economics of migration literature if migrants are positively or negatively selected. I'm going to argue with historical data. Of course, I don't have data as in nowadays studies. I'm going to discuss that immigrants were positively selected. And finally, I'm going to show you some data that show very clearly that immigrants to Latin America had higher levels of literacy than native population. This is particularly the case in Brazil. Well, this is something that you could find in any study on migration all over the world, and regardless the time or place, there is always an advantage to have migrants coming from similar cultural background, and there is always an advantage to have migrants, for migrants themselves and for the society of destination, to have migrants with the same language. That allows, the assimilation is easy and allows for migrants to have a high possibility of upward social mobility in destination countries. So from that point of view, we could say that migrants from Southern Europe made rational choices when they select Latin American countries as destination. They decided to go to places where that background and the language advantage could be maximized in the long run. Italy is very specific or peculiar case because it's not so clear that, of course, they had the similar cultural background, similar religion, but no colonial links, and language, although similar, is not the advantage of common language. But in any case, we could include, all the European migrants in the same box. If you have this pool of migrants coming to Latin American countries, what we would expect, and is the historical outcome, is that we are going to find these migrants in skilled works, moving very easily into commerce and business, as for example the northern Italians did in Argentina. We are going to find the Spaniards in a privileged position in Cuba, for example, after independence, almost dominating the banking business, from clerks to bank owners. We are going to find also that the Portuguese concentrated in urban occupations in Brazil, and for example they join in a very massive way the rank of school teachers, administrative clerks, and so on and so forth. And by the way, this seems to be also the case in the American economy, and recently the new immigrants, the so-called new immigrants that formerly were characterized as backward and low quality, in the recent studies we have, they have shown that they exhibit a high degree of mobility into well-paid white-collar employments in the American economy. But I'm not going to just to think. Another piece of evidence that we could put together in order to have this overall picture of how they assimilated and how was their fortune in the countries of destinations is property. Why property? Because we have, in looking at data, historical sources of data, we have very good data on ownership, not very good data on wages or income. So what I'm going to do is to exploit and to do whatever I can with the data on ownership that we have particularly for Argentina, and I'm going to compare Italian and Spanish in Argentina before the First World War. For example, in 1914, and this is the population census, 25% of Italians, adult population, owned some type of property, and that was very similar to the native born, and it was really much higher than the Spanish case, because only 60% of the Spanish immigrants owned property in 1914. So this raises the first question. If the Spanish group had the advantage of the language, why the Italians were much more successful in terms of ownership? Again, I'm prepared to discuss if this measure of success, the ownership of property, is the right one or not. I agree that maybe it's not the case. We have to take into account if the migrants intended to settle permanently in the country or going back, and so on and so forth. But what I have is pictures, and one picture is 1914, and another picture is the former census, 1895. And I am going to concentrate it in 1895, where we are going to find exactly the same picture. This is the percentage of owners according to the population census by nationality, and you see, of course, the Swiss is absolutely, it's an outlier, but I'm going to concentrate on the Spaniards and the Italians, because I wanted to bring back the idea of those people were the ones who had a priori the advantages of cultural background, religion, language, and so on and so forth. And the Italians were doing very well right from the beginning, and from the beginning I mean 1890s, after the first big wave of Italian migrants to Argentina. This has two possible explanations, and I'm going to look to this problem from the Spanish side. The Spanish migrants, as I said, had two important advantages compared to Italian immigrants. Literacy rates were higher, I'm going to show you the data in a minute, and they share the same language. They had two important disadvantages. They arrived later. The massive wave of Italian migrants is 1870s, 1880s, and the Spanish group is later on. The peak in the Spanish immigration to Argentina is just before First World War. And not only that, the Spanish flow, I'm going to show you some data, but it's very preliminary, show a growing number of families, large families, and the larger the family, the lower the possibility of savings, therefore the higher obstacles to acquire property or to show the same success in terms of property as the Italians. This is the data I'm going to show you. This is something very specific, because it's not the population census, the official data. These are the original material of the census. It is a sample of Italian and Spanish migrants living in Argentina in 1895. It's a random sample. They were selected according to the initial of the surname, M and G. That's very common surnames for the two groups. And I'm going to show you some part of this material. I have two different subsamples. One is family groups for Italian and for Spanish immigrants, and the other one is individuals. Unfortunately for me, very few of the almost more than 4,000 migrants forming families in the Italian case living in Buenos Aires in 1895, very few of them reported property. One could say, well, they didn't report property because they didn't want to, but there isn't any reason for that. It was not for fiscal purpose. The census is a population census. So if there is a bias, it could be a bias with no consequences. And it could be the same bias for the Spanish case, where you can see only 76% of the sample declared that they had some kind of property in 1895. The data are comparable The mean age of the owners is very similar, 41 in the Spanish case, 41 in the Italian case, 42.6 in the Spanish case. It's more or less very similar, except in the rate of ownership by illiterates. I mean, people with without knowing neither to read nor to write, that were already owners of property in Buenos Aires in 1895. So this raises my first question, that it seems to suggest that literacy, after all, was not a great advantage, because the Italians, even though they had higher illiteracy rates than the Spanish groups, they did much better in terms of ownership. But I mean, this is something I'm just working right now, so I have a lot of questions and a lot of things going on in my head, but I don't have any proper answer to tell you, or any finished story to tell you about this. The other thing we should look at is the length of residence, because, I mean, if a group is living in a destination country for a long number of years, the probability that they acquire property is higher than if they have just arrived. So what I did, because I mean the census didn't ask when did you arrive to the country, there is not a clue about that. But since I have families, and since according to Argentinian legislation, every child born in Argentina is considered citizen of the country. What I did is for each family group, look at the age of the first child born in Argentina. And you see, I mean, this is just random, I mean, to see, there are many peculiar cases here. The first one, this Luis Mola, was born in Naples, also his wife. There is someone, Ernesto Mola, that could be a son or could be a brother, young brother, born in Naples as well. But there is a child, Antonio, born in Capital, in Buenos Aires, 6 years. So that means that the family at least is living for 6 years in Buenos Aires. The other case is even more peculiar, because there is this family, Santiago Ghisolino. The first child, Josefa, was born in Buenos Aires, but then they went back to Italy, but they have 3 children born in Italy, and Cayetano, the youngest one, was born in Buenos Aires again. So at least they have been in Buenos Aires or in Argentina for 10 years. So with this procedure, I calculated the length of residence in Argentina. Let me warn you, this is just for families. This is just for families that have children born in the country, because if not, I cannot. It's impossible to know the length of residence in the country. So it's it has a lot of constraint, this information. But just to show you that the majority of the Italians, as the green one, has been in the country between 5 years and 6 to 10. This the second 1 to 5 years in the country is the result of the short period where the Argentinian government paid for passages to immigrants from Europe. That was the majority of the free paid passages were delivered in Spain and Italy, and there you have that the majority of them are living in the country between 1 and 5 years. But the main difference is between 6 and 10. And in that case, you could say, well, that's the explanation. The Italians are living in the country for a long period, so that's why they acquired property. But if you go to the cohort from 11 to 20 years, it's the other way around. The Spaniards are there for a longer period of time. So my intuition or my hypothesis that it was a question of the Italians arriving earlier, I don't know if that's the case looking at this data, but still, I would like to discuss, I mean, if some of you have ideas of what to do with this information. The other possibility, as I told you, working to the disadvantage of the Spanish immigrants in Argentina is the family size. And what I see here, particularly if you look at the last column, is that in 1895 you have that 83% of Spanish immigrants arrive without family. And in 1913, 56%. So there is a growing proportion of Spanish family emigrating in family groups, arriving to Argentina not as one single individual, normally a male, and then the family. There we have families arriving right from the beginning in a higher proportion. And you see also that the average size of the family, that it was 2.3 for the Spanish case in 1895, rise to 3.2 in 1913, while in the Italian case it's exactly the opposite. The Italians started emigrating in family groups much more in the late 19th century, and as individuals much more before First World War. So with all these data, what I would like is to think a little bit more about if it's true that there was an advantage of sharing the same language of the country of destination, if it's true that there has something to do with the length of residence in the country, or if it is possible to say something about the family groups and the different possibilities of savings and therefore acquire property over time. What I haven't explored, and maybe the clue is there, is occupation. I also have the information on occupations for all this sample of the 1895 census, as I told you before. So this is one piece of evidence. I'm going to make a break to tell you that for most of the problems that I'm going to put here in the table, I don't have a solution. I mean, I'm just thinking with you. I mean, I'm just sharing with you some problems and some ways of looking in a different way to all problems in the literature. Well, this is something very for me, very obvious. Immigrants were positively selected, and we know that because if we compare the rates of literacy of a Spanish population as an aggregate in 1910, the Spanish population census in 1910, the rate of literacy of Spanish immigrants in Argentina or even in Brazil was much higher. So, and this is because of, as you can imagine, emigration is a very selective process. Immigrants are highly concentrated in a very specific age group, young male, and also it's a very selective process in terms of regional origins. I mean, the majority of Spanish and Portuguese immigrants came from the north of the country, where the rates of literacy are higher than in the south. And it's exactly the same in the case of Italy. The rates of literacy are much higher in the north of the country, and that is the region of origin of Italian immigrants to Latin America. If we look at the immigrants already living in the country, living in Argentina in 1914, and this is not the sample, this is the census, the general census. You see that for Spanish males, the rate of literacy is the highest, compared with the native-born Argentina and compared with Italians. There are not so many differences in the case of women, and overall what we see is that those poor, backward and ignorant immigrants, the Southern European immigrants, at least in Argentina, are not so backward or ignorant in terms of literacy rates. This is the census. This is the sample of the census. And here we find, the same picture, although more intensified, because if you look at urban males, Spanish immigrants, males living in urban, particularly in Buenos Aires, in 1895 in Argentina, you see that the rate of literacy is 87%. this is similar to what the Swedish or the Danish immigrants going to the United States. This is really very high rates of literacy. So I think with all of this material, we should reconsider the idea that the majority of immigrants to Latin America, particularly to Argentina, Brazil is a case that I'm going to discuss now, but with this data, I think we should rethink the idea that Latin American countries, particularly Argentina, receive backward and ignorant immigrants coming from Southern Europe. The last piece of evidence in this context is something quite obvious. I mean, immigrants to Latin America, and this is the case of Brazil particularly, had higher levels of literacy than native population. And this is very obvious in Brazil, not as much in Argentina, although we can say something about that. In Brazil, there is the traditional view that since the levels of literacy of human capital of the Brazilian population, because of the former slavery economy, were very, very low, immigrants, even though they were, I mean, the majority of them illiterates, they had higher levels of human capital than the native population. Okay, that was the idea, and I mean, nobody discussed for many years. The American Gram volume is 1979, so I mean, that was the idea, and that was, I mean, all over the literature. But recently, and these papers are very, very recent, they are from economists, economic historians, and they are showing with new data, for example, using what they call numeracy, that is a variable similar to literacy, although with numbers. I mean, when people round their age, and because they don't know exactly, I mean, what age they have, and they use, it's a very well-known variable used to when you don't have data on literacy, and you use as an alternative to measure human capital. So in this last paper, 2013, they show, I mean, George Batten and collaborators, that human capital endowment of international migrants in Brazil, in the last part I'm going to talk about the Brazilian immigration policy, and you will see how Brazil is supposed to have received the poor of the poorest, the more backward, the more ignorant, because they paid for the travel, and the immigrants were supposed to replace the slave labor force. But even in that case, the recent evidence we have is that immigrants had higher literacy and higher, human capital, at least higher numeracy than the native population. And not only that, they had a positive effects. They had positive effect in the literacy rates of the regions where the immigrants settled, particularly the colonies in the southern states of Brazil. They have positive effects not only in literacy rates, also in regional per capita income. They have positive effects in the supply of public instruction in the state of Sao Paulo. The number of schools in the regions of Sao Paulo where the immigrants' colonies were settled is higher than any other place in the States. And there are regions with less poverty, better health, better education outcomes. So it seems, I mean, if you were American Graham writing in 1979, you were absolutely amazed to see that how the picture is entirely reversed. Now it seems like Brazilian immigration had extraordinary positive and enduring effect in those regions where immigrants settled. And of course, there is a trick here, because I mean, people talk about Brazil, and actually what they are looking at is very tiny and small part of southern states in Brazil, and within the Sao Paulo state in a very specific and particular localities where the immigrants or Santa Catarina or whatever, where immigrants colonies were formed in the late 19th century. But nevertheless, there is something going on reivindicating the idea that even in the case of Brazil, there was a positive effect of these immigrants that were supposed to be with very low quality. So this thing, the reasoning behind all these very complicated and technical papers from the economist side is that immigrants brought with them a tradition that it was absolutely unknown in 19th century Brazil. That's compulsory formal education. Someone told me once that this is impossible because there was no compulsory formal education in Europe in the 19th century. Yes, there was. In Prussia, there was a compulsory formal education in the German case, and it's actually there are a lot of qualitative accounts on how German immigrants founded their own schools. They put a lot of pressure to have schools, and also in the Italian case, for example, the Italian government financed and put a lot of money in creating Italian schools in Brazil for Italian immigrant children. And in Argentina, we could argue that one of the reasons why the government passed the 1884 educational law that made education compulsory for all children, for primary education, was because they wanted to stop the creation of Italian schools, and they wanted to incorporate and to make Argentinians of the children of immigrants already living in the country. So, but there's something that we can discuss. Well, I'm not going to discuss today this, but just for you to think about it. If you read any work on migration nowadays, there is always this idea that migrants are also positively selected in terms of entrepreneurs, willingness to take risk, their motivation, they are prepared to, they are highly mobile population, they are looking for different jobs and so on and so forth. So, and if that is true for certain periods and certain places, why is not true for in historical terms? So I would like to elaborate a little bit, not today, but this idea of if immigration in Latin America add to the whole societies special skills, special entrepreneurial abilities. It seems to be the case in Argentina, where they concentrated in the commercial business and industry, particularly in the Italian case, is not there is not such a consensus or formal view in the case of Brazil. Some scholars think that was the case, particularly for Sao Paulo urban industry, and others disagree. But I'm not going to discuss this today. So the second part of the talk, which is related to quality, is the political economy of immigration policy. The idea is the following. I'm always my starting point is the standard view, what you would find in any textbook. The standard view is the Latin American countries had open doors policy. They never select immigrants. They admitted almost everybody. Even more, they pay for the trip to the most destitute and poor and backward people in Europe, just because, this is the case of Brazil, because they wanted to replace the slave labor force. So therefore, since they did not select, or they didn't put any barrier to the massive entrance of immigrants, they receive low quality immigrants. In the case of Argentina, this is explained because the political power is absolutely dominated by the landowners, and they were very much in favor of having huge supplies of labor in order to keep wages low, and in the case of Brazil is even more the case, because not only it's an open door policy, it's an addition. The state of Sao Paulo paid subsidies to European migrants to go to Brazil to work in the coffee plantations. This is the standard view, and this is what I'm going to qualify. In the case of Argentina, as I said, this is it's quite neat. The idea that, of course, they had an open door policy because the political power were dominated by those who had most to gain with an abundant supply of labor, landowners and urban capitalists. The idea, the first query is, even more, if we consider that the majority of the immigrant population could not vote in Argentinian elections, not because of any discrimination, just because they were foreigners, and as foreigners they were not allowed to vote in elections in Argentina. A very different problem, and I would love if someone had any explanation for that, is why the rate of naturalization of immigrants in Argentina was so low, because around 1914 only 1.6 of all foreigners, were more or less 30% of the population, were citizens. The rest were with their nationality of origin, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, or whatever. This is a sharp contrast with the United States, because in the United States, immigrants became citizens very fast, very smoothly, and they became a political presence, and the American political parties, particularly the Democratic Party, always look for the vote of the immigrant population. In the Argentinian case, it's impossible. They couldn't look for the vote of the workers, of the foreign workers, because they couldn't vote. Again, I insist, it's not a question of discrimination from the political system, it's a question of that they opted for not being citizens in Argentina. So what I did, and I'm going to move a little bit further to see, to show you the pink link. What I did is to build an index of immigration policy in Argentina. Because there is always the question, well, the immigration policy was open, was closed, was half open. How do we know? How do we measure? If the country had an open door policy or not. And the only way to measure, and this has a lot of discussion going on, because in an index you always give a value that is very subjective, but I built this index, following very carefully legislation, administrative decrees. Every time there was a change in the whole procedure for the entrance of immigrants, I changed the value, and so on and so forth. And this is the pink line. 0 is close, absolutely close, no immigrants at all, they never reach that point, and 10 is completely open, and Argentina reached that point just in 4 years of the 19th century, when the government paid for subsidies, for travel subsidies for immigrants in Europe. And the rest is very open until the 1902, the beginning of the 20th century, and then you see that this is not the case of a completely open door policy, because without changing legislation, because the general immigration law didn't change, through administrative decrees, the country became more and more close to immigrants. So with that index, and with something that I'm going to summarize here, because it's a different paper, the main result I reach is the following. The classic variables that one used to find out which were the reason for a country to become more open or more closed work perfectly well in the Argentinian case. For example, inequality. as inequality grew, the country became more close and proved to be important. Immigration policy is closely related to the closing of the frontier. I know that Alejandra disagrees, but it's not the case that the frontier cannot be related to immigration policy because immigrants were not to work on the land and they remain in the cities. It's a question of, from the point of view of the policy makers, they were really obsessed with hands to work in the land. And this is the graph I showed you before. This is the blue line is the frontier, and the index of immigration policy is absolutely closely related to the closing or, the extinction of the frontier. What I discovered is that in addition of the classical variables, inequality, stock of foreign population, the closing of the frontier, the number of the growth of the economy, and so on and so forth, in the Argentinian case, immigration was also associated from the point of view of those making legislation, and those policy makers were closely associated with social unrest and labor conflicts. So if you introduce in this quantitative exercise the number of strikes, it's significantly related to a more restrictive immigration policy. So this is just in graphical form the number of strikes and the closing of the country to mass immigration in this period, 1870-1930. So in a paradoxical way, finally, those who had most to gain with an elastic supply of labor were the ones that identified social conflict, labor unrest, violent strikes with immigration, and they therefore consequently closed the country to foreign immigrants. What I'm now thinking is in the Brazilian case, because it's the most outstanding case in Latin America for immigration policy. I haven't built the same index for Brazil. It's difficult because, there isn't any, the index would be like this, because, I have to look with more detail to the administrative decrees and so on and so forth, but a priori what you find is that Brazil never selected immigrants, never closed the country. On the contrary, they developed an extraordinarily successful program paying for the travel to masses of immigrants in Southern Europe, and when the European sources started to dry, they looked for Japanese because, the main objective was to keep the labor flowing in a massive way in order to keep wages low. Actually, we can discuss if Brazil did have a selective immigration policy. Just the opposite of the Australian case. In the Australian case, they try to reduce the immigrant flow in order to keep wages high for the native population in Australia. The Brazilian did the opposite. They had to non-select immigration in order to keep the wages low and to accept, constant labor supply and massive workers. And they as I was saying, were extraordinarily successful. And they developed something that I'm not going to explain because, most of you would know. This system of the colono contract linked to the subsidies for transportation, and it worked beautifully from the point of view of those who designed that system, that is, having a lot of immigrants coming to work in the coffee plantations, and actually it was beneficial for the two parts, because the colono family and the colono agreement were in the end positive for the immigrants themselves, and also for the coffee planters who design and who finance this system. The question is, why subsidies lasted for such a long time? Because if you look at the graph, The blue line is the subsidized immigration, and the red line is the non-subsidized immigration. It's free migrants decided to pay on their own to go to Brazil. And at a certain point in time, around 1905, 1906, the number of non-subsidized immigrants arriving to Brazil is higher than the one being paid by the Sao Paulo government. So the first question is why they kept subsidizing for such a long period of time, when the reality was that people were arriving anyway. That was the Argentinian experience after the barring crisis. They decided not to subsidize any longer because, immigrants were arriving without doing anything. And the other question is, what happened within the Brazilian society and the Brazilian population? Because it is clear that for Brazilian natives, the counterfactual scenario of no massive immigration paid for the southern state would have resulted in a higher demand for native labor within Brazil and for more internal migration from the northern state to the southern state. And not in the 19th century, but from the First World War, the native Brazilians started moving in a very massive way to the south, and they were replacing, particularly during the years of the war, they were replacing the European migrants, and they continue doing so in the 1920s. So I have a lot of questions that I think it's worthwhile to ask. Why coffee planters prefer to subsidize immigration from Europe instead of subsidize internal migration from Brazil? It was a question of discrimination. They absolutely prefer white European workers instead of mulatto or native Brazilians. It was a question of transport costs, because it was cheaper to pay for subsidies to cross the Atlantic than to pay for subsidies to cross Brazil, mainland Brazil, mainly. It could be because, before the railway, it was very expensive to transport passengers and goods in inland transportation in Brazil. But they could always use coastal navigation, and they never, there was never discussed about that possibility. There was never a discussion. They always opted for pay for subsidies for European migrants, particularly for Brazilians, for Italians, sorry. So I don't have any conclusions, that's why the question mark. I just, as you can gather, I'm reflecting with you on certain problems that I think that should merit a deep historical research. I think there are a lot of very well, beautifully research done on Latin America immigration in specific cases for specific nationalities, for specific problems. But overall, when we compare, when we look at the global labor market in the late 19th century up to the Great Depression, there is always a bias towards the United States, towards Canada, towards Australia, and there is in the historical research on migration, there is always this hole on Latin American countries. And my purpose, if I manage to finish this monograph, is to incorporate, these experiences of Latin American countries on this global literature on labor markets. So this is it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Blanca, very much for the very comprehensive presentation. I'll open to the floor for questions or comments. Koba, okay.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I really liked it. There's so much information here that I really don't know where to start. But maybe I will start from the last part of the presentation. I was wondering whether you have some hypothesis as to why You haven't mentioned anything about labor unrest in Brazil.
Labor, sorry? Unrest.
And strikes and all that, but it seems to me that, especially because so many immigrants were coming in and to keep wages low, I don't know, unrest within the native population, but also in the immigrant population should be higher than in the case of Argentina, but you haven't mentioned that variable, so that would be my first question. The second question would be related to the issue of citizenship policies, and you didn't explain very well what was the policy in Argentina concerning the right to citizenship. It seems from your presentation that it was really or very easy, and that the question there is why, if it was that easy, Italians got the citizenship much more than Spanish. I was wondering, in retrospect, whether you have information about return migration and whether this could be because Spanish immigrants returned to Spain much more, so whether their less access to citizenship had to do because they saw themselves as transitory immigrants there in Argentina. So maybe you have some information about return migration as well. And finally, going back to the beginning, I'm a little bit surprised about the starting point of the presentation, that was basically, low income and poor quality immigrants going to Latin America, explaining why Latin America performance has been worse than immigration in the United States because of high quality migrants going to the US as opposed to Latin America. But it seems to me that looking into the variation within Latin American countries that received versus those that didn't receive immigrants, and even within countries, as you were showing in the case of Brazil, north versus south, you have there is a natural experiment that allows to draw conclusions about the positive effect of immigration in these countries in terms of growth and many other things that you hint at in your presentation. So I was wondering, because I'm relatively new to this literature, whether there are these kinds of studies that exploit the natural experiment within variation in countries, depending on whether they received or not immigrants. My hunch is that it is pretty obvious that it was very positive, the effect of immigration there. Sorry for the long 3 questions.
No. Well, the first one, it was about labor unrest and strikes in Brazil. Strikes and labor unrest were basically an urban phenomenon. And the majority of immigrants in Brazil were in the coffee plantations and then moved to the cities. But it's not at the same time as Argentina. It's a little bit later. It's in the 1920s when you have enough population, urban population, workers in the city, that strikes started. So, in the 19th century, before First World War, there is some clashes between, for example, the black population and the Italians. That is very interesting in Sao Paulo, because they were competing not for the same job, but they were competing in the same labor market, and they have some problems with that. And yes, they had strikes, but very much concentrated in the 1920s and in Sao Paulo city. It's not like in Argentina that you have a more spread labor unrest, and you have also a strike of tenants in the rural area, and it's much more developed society in terms of labor movement. But I should explore that. The second question was about citizenship policy. It was not more easy for the Italians than for the Spaniards. It was easy for everybody. Everybody could acquire citizenship in Argentina. The whole legislation was prepared for that, because they were trying to attract people and to make Argentinian citizenship the value of immigration. But the majority of the immigrants, particularly the Italians, opted not for not losing the Italian nationality. There is, I think it was Tullio Alperin, the one who wrote that in the 1870s, in some places in Argentina, in the rural areas, the native Argentinians would have need a consulate for themselves, because the Italian consul was defending the Italian citizens there. The Spanish consul was defending and fighting for the Spanish citizens, and the native Argentinians had nobody looking after them. The majority of them, they didn't want to become nationals. What it's interesting to see is how the different governments, the Spanish governments, the Italian government, and the Argentinian government fight for this question of nationality. Because the Italians said, okay, double nationality. I mean, if they wanted to be Argentinian, that's fine, but at the same time, they keep the Italian nationality. And they had a lot of problems with that. But individually, the most common explanation is why they needed to be citizen. They had access to civil service without being Argentinians. They could acquire property, inherit, pass the property to the siblings, have the same civil rights, maintain their religion, culture. Why on earth they needed to be Argentinians? And this is the standard explanation. I'm not saying that this is the real one, but I don't find any other competing explanation to explain that. Return migration, yes, I haven't mentioned return migration. It's important. It's not as high as is traditionally believed, because the stereotype is that in the United States, the new immigrants were the ones moving back and forth, and the old immigrants were settled in the land, and so on and so forth. In the Argentinian and Brazilian case, the idea is since they are later in time with the steamships and the easy crossing of the Atlantic, the rate of return were very high, but not as high. If I remember correctly, for the Italian case it was 30%, the rate of return. It's more or less the case of the United States. It's not higher or lower. So, but yes, it's something that I should include in all the discussion I've made today. And the other thing is, maybe I explain myself very poorly, talking about poor quality of immigrants. I'm not saying that the poor quality of immigrants is the explanation of the poor economic growth of Latin American economies in the 20th century. No. What I'm saying is that I was wondering at the beginning why there isn't any consensus among historians, among economic and social historians, talking about global migration. The idea is there is a consensus, there is an agreement that for the United States, for Canada, and even for Australia, immigration was something good. Had a lot of positive consequences in the long run. When you reach to Latin American countries, there is this mixed view. Well, for someone was good, for others not. There are countries that never receive immigrants, or very few, very tiny minority. Mexico is the case in point, with very, very few numbers of, by the way, very selected Spanish migrants. Chile is the other case that, had a nice economic growth all over the period, and is not a country of massive immigration. So was not associating poor quality immigrants with poor economic growth. I was just saying that why is this image of Latin American immigration not such clear and neat as in the American case? And one of the explanations is, well, because Latin American countries receive poor quality immigrants, from the sources, from the European sources, not looking at the long run performance of Latin American countries. I think maybe
Natalia, please.
Thank you for your presentation.
presentation. I really enjoyed it. There were two questions that I wanted to raise. One is going back to that point, the second point that you were answering about it. And I think a lot about it. They had all the facilities. It was very easy to become an Argentine national. But it seems by the examples that you presented that there were no disincentives. I mean, there was no punitive thing. If you didn't become an Argentine citizen, then nothing bad would happen to you. And I think of someone like myself, and I wouldn't want to become naturalized in the UK if I didn't have to. But I have to, because otherwise I'm not welcome. And this, I think, is something that you might look at in other immigrant cases where people tend to assimilate and become citizens more. I mean, I think of the condition of the immigrant itself. I mean, there's always that idea of nationality and wanting to keep it, and the idea that you can be a dual citizenship or not. It's also about how onerous it is to retain your nationality. If being an Italian and you have a consul who's going to fight for your rights is an advantage, why would you want to give that up? If, on the other hand, having a passport that nobody wants you to have, then of course that's an incentive to move. So I think that I don't think it's that surprising. If it's very easy to become a citizen, but there's nothing wrong if you don't, then why would you? If, as I say, there will be incentives if you actually keep your Italian or Spanish nationality. So I think that there might be more truth than you think in those personal narratives of why people didn't give up their nationality. I think that you should discount that, and you may want to look at the other places, what other things were there. It wasn't just about it being hard or easy, but maybe the fact that there were no punitive actions. So that was just more of a comment. But my question had more to do with numbers. When we think of places that have massive immigration in Latin America, we of course have to think of Sao Paulo and Argentina, because it's also interesting to me in terms of relative numbers that of people who are there. Right? I have heard this number very often, that there were actually, in numerical terms, more Italians that went to the state of Sao Paulo than Italians that went to Argentina. That they feel like there are more because there were less people there already. So I don't know if that was true or not. I mean,
No, it's not.
But and then my question was, like, in terms of how the other migrant examples that you present, say the US or Canada or Australia, was it that, again, the number of people who were there compared to the people coming? I mean, the impact, the total impact they had on the shaping of the populations that were there. If you think of Argentina, it is very much an immigrant country because you see them everywhere. Whereas if you go even to Sao Paulo, where there's lots of immigrants, you still feel that there were lots of people there before them, mainly slaves, ex-slaves.
Starting for the second one, I'm sorry, I had some data on the immigration rate. I mean, relating to the size of the native population, but I thought it was so obvious for this audience of Latin Americans that I took it out of the presentation. But you are right. I mean, that's one of my points. From the point of view of the scholar interest, I mean, and from the point of view of the impact of immigrants in a given society, the impact is much higher in Argentina or in Sao Paulo than in the United States, or in Canada, or in Australia. I mean, in any case, I mean, Argentina is outstanding. Brazil is in the 1890s that had really concentration and had one of the highest, jointly with Argentina, highest immigration rate. The other case is very early in time, is Australia in the 1860s, but I mean, very punctual. But from that point of view, I think is the impact of the foreign population, as you were mentioning, in Argentina and in Sao Paulo, is much higher than in the United States, absolutely. And the second, your first point is very interesting because I never have thought about the disadvantages, as you were saying. So it's important why there was no punitive action if you don't become citizen. But the question still is why the Argentinian government did didn't do anything to install or to force immigrants to naturalize. From the point of view of the immigrant themselves, it's absolutely rational. I mean, you don't have nothing to lose and you have a lot of things to gain. So, I mean, you keep your nationality and that's it. But from the point of view of the country of destination, and given the fact that they wanted to incorporate and to be educated immigration children and to have a lot of citizens and so on and so forth, I mean, why there was not any systematic policy of punitive or making more difficult to keep your own nationality over time? I don't know. But it's interesting to look to the problem from the other point. Yeah.
Greece first and then Tom? Oh, sorry. You first.
Okay, thank you. You spoke very eloquently about when discussing the census statistics that you presented us, and I have one or two point questions about those. First, you refer to Buenos Aires, but you mean the city or the city and province?
No, city. Sorry, right. I should have mentioned.
Secondly, how much confidence do you have in these statistics? And when you come up with a figure of something around 86 or 87% literacy for one Southern European group, one starts wondering how far can statistics be falsified by government? I mean, what interest in government, may there be interest in government want to promote a positive image of migration in order to attract high quality migrants in the so-called in the future? Do you have any knowledge of how the census was performed and how much credence to attach to it? And then on the Brazilian side, you talked about the policy of what I take to be the state of Sao Paulo initially, with regard to subsidies or subventions to Southern European immigration, perhaps immigration from elsewhere. But you also speak of a Brazilian policy, so I wanted to ask you when this became a Brazilian policy and not merely a Paulista policy.
No, it was always, sorry, I should have been very more careful in defining that Buenos Aires is Buenos Aires city and not the province, and the Brazilian policy is Sao Paulo policy. I mean, that's for sure. But maybe it was my mistake. And the other thing is the information of the census. I don't have any clue about the credibility of the information, but I don't see any reason why the census taker going home to home had any interest in writing yes when asking people, do you know how to read and write? And I don't know, this is the original material of the census. I mean, it's the 1914 census is published, I mean, it's in 10 volumes. I mean, it's you don't know what is behind. I mean, you just see the final information. But this is not. I mean, this is the original material of the official of the census going home by home and asking people. And unless everybody agrees, I mean, all the Spaniards agree that we are going to say that we know how to read and write, I don't see any bias in that. My intuition is that the material is credible. I mean,
well, how can you be certain the people are at home and want them to be out there? There are lots of problems with conducting such a census on a door-by-door basis. Yes. And just connected with those issues, where I must give way, but one small thought about property ownership. There was an underlying assumption in what you were saying that well, there appeared to be, that property ownership was perceived as desirable.
yeah.
But there are cultures where rental housing is seen as preferable. And I wonder how far some Europeans arrived with a cultural preference for renting housing. Why invest in it in it if you're not certain you're going to stay for
Well, I did mention that obviously this is, we have to take into account if they intended to be permanent migrants or not. But the standard literature on migration says that one of the main aims of migrants is to acquire property and to become owners, something that they are not in their countries of origin, or to a certain extent they own different property, or if they form a family. And this is because this is why I look at families at the same time. One of the main purposes to have a property. I mean, you earn money, and since provided that you have your whole family in the country of destination, and that you decided that you are going to live there at least for 10 years, as we have seen that was the case for the Spanish families, you acquire property. Something that, I mean, I am assuming this because this is the standard view in the literature on migrants. I mean,
yes, I'd agree it's the standard view, but I'm still sceptical, because I then
Could
hear
be.
about the numbers of anarchists who are perhaps hostile to the notion of private property being extremely active in the period that we're speaking about in Argentina, and to a much lesser extent in
no, but it's curious what you are saying, because I mean the traditional view, particularly in the case of Argentina, is that immigrants couldn't become owners, particularly of the land, because the land property was controlled by big landowners, and they prevented the immigrants to become owners, and that was a failure. And of course, if you compare to the States or to Canada, and finally immigrants had to become tenants, agricultural tenants. But underneath that view is the idea that they would have loved to become landowners, but they were prevented to do so because of this oligarchy or group. So this is why I consider, particularly in the Argentinian case, that the rate of ownership is something that reflects in a view that an immigrant first settled in the country, acquired property in the country, and to a certain point it's a sign of success. But I'm prepared to discuss that maybe it's not the case. I mean, this is my assumption.
I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
Había otro.
Okay, well, this is a really interesting, wide-ranging talk. Thank you. I think I don't know if this. I mean, one of the things I'm getting from your talk is a sort of implicit critique of the idea of this discussion about how immigrant quality as a sort of inherent absolute thing you either have or you don't. I'm getting. I think one of the larger contributions you might be able to make is to have us think about that as a relational, contextual quality, much thinking historically about that. This takes me to my first question, which is, this may be a silly question, but I guess I'm a Mexicanist, so forgive me. I guess I'm just wondering whether we can really take it for granted that being Spanish is all that much of a cultural advantage. Okay, you've got the language, but you've also got colonial history, post-colonial history. In Mexico, you have anti-Spanish xenophobia, which was very strong through the 19th century, and then again during the Mexican Revolution, much more so than anti-Yankee phobia, apparently. And then again, in the case of Cuba, it's okay, it might be an advantage to be a Spanish immigrant there, but that may not have less to do with may have more to do with the US occupation than popular attitudes after 1898. So I'm just wondering if we can really take that for granted in a way, whether it's worth digging into that. The second thing, I guess it's just an encouragement to dig. I think for the puzzle about of low levels of naturalization, it is really interesting. I think you will need to dig more into Argentine politics and how it works. I mean, before 1912, there's not really much point voting because it doesn't have much effect. afterwards, okay, maybe there is more, but after 1912, you also have, if you're a citizen, you also have to do military service if you're a man. So there's a big disincentive there. Because perhaps, I mean, you'd have to see how people thought about it. And maybe there's less, you know, also if it's strikes that are really having more political, that's where your voice comes from. Maybe voting, it seems less important still into the 1920s. So I think, you know, there may be some answers more answers in that. And well, I had another third question, just a simple question. I mean, how do you calculate the frontier closing? I'm just wondering how that, how do you quantify that? I'm interested in where those figures come from.
Is the number of hectares that you are cultivating each year.
Okay.
Yeah, I did the reverse, I mean, in order to show the graph closing, the line closing, but it's like that. I mean,
okay, so it's the number of the amount of new land that's cultivated.
Okay. Yeah. The first thing about quality, I was prepared to discuss what is quality exactly. I mean, there is, for economists it's very easy. I mean, it's quality in the labor market is measured by qualification, skills and income. Since we don't have income data, I mean wages or we have, but it's very difficult to assign to nationals of different groups among immigrants. And qualification is always a problem because, I mean, you can see that skills, skilled professions, semi-skills, and there is always a debate on how to classify the different occupations and professions according to skills. What the other thing is, look for the most basic measure of human capital, that is literacy, and this is the thing I'm using.
Some of the other things you talk about, like being Spanish, for example.
No, but this is
completely contextual.
Yeah, but this is something different. Maybe I have to distinguish between being Spanish and speaking the language. That is something different. The language is an advantage, for sure. I mean, in any case. But being Spanish, I agree with you. I mean, even in Argentina in the mid-19th century, I mean, up to the 1870s, I mean, there was very strong Spanish attitude, and they were not very well received. But they change. I mean, there is a complete change. There is one, this very well-known book of Jose Moya, Cousin and Strangers, and he explains how by the centennial anniversary, by 1910, there was this idea of now we are all Latins and we share the same culture and the same cultural heritage and so on and so forth, and they praise the Spaniards in relation to these Syrians and Lebanese and these people that are not as we are Latins. So, I mean, there is an evolution in that. And in Mexico, yes, I mean, it's a completely different story of that. It's very similar the case with the Portuguese in Brazil. They had the same anti-Portuguese, anti-metropoli reaction, but in the end, I mean, they, particularly when you have different groups, new groups arriving. In the case of Portuguese in Brazil was with the Japanese. I mean, they suddenly discovered, well, these Japanese people are really, really different. I mean, we rather prefer the Portuguese. And your last point, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, strikes, demonstrations, even anarchism was a different way of participating in politics. And even from the point of view of professional associations or business organization, they were controlled by Italians, for example. And they had very fluid relations with the political power in Argentina, so maybe that was another addition. Reason was they didn't need to vote, because I mean they participate in politics in a different way.
And I mean, it's a mix. If you were an Argentine oligarch, I'd like to think, you know, I mean, it's a mixed blessing giving all these immigrant citizenship, isn't it? Because you could possibly kind of mould them and control them, but then they're all going to want to vote as well.
Yeah.
That's
well, the social.
in terms of how Argentina's political system is changing, that's a Pandora's box.
The only party that really made campaign in favor of foreigners and naturalization was the Socialist Party. Juan Bejuste was the only one. I mean, the rest, the radicals never pay any attention to this question.
Interesting.
I have a question over there.
Yes. Hi. I've worked a bit on representations of immigrants in the River Plate and also comparatively in Chile, actually. And some of your data and examples, some are quite add to the picture sort of I had, and some seem to go with it. For example, I was in terms of what you talked about, or part of what you mean by quality of immigration and relation, for example, between higher level of literacy among the Spanish, but lower levels of ownership. For example, that was one of your examples.
Yeah.
I looked, for instance, at the popular press, and in a lot of cases, the Spanish immigrants, especially from the north, were actually described as not very entrepreneurial. They were usually more interested in sort of becoming lawyers or teachers, or rather than being interested in the private sector. So they were actually quite criticized quite a lot for that. So that seems somehow to correspond to that picture that, at least from the point of view of how they were perceived. So that I found that quite interesting. And it went also with the idea of the Latin immigrant and how different it could be from it. And in fact, a lot of people did seem to want more, at least in theory, immigration from Anglo-Saxon countries, but they simply thought it was quite difficult to get those sorts of people interested in coming to Argentina, for instance. It's not like they didn't want them, but actually, it was seen as pretty difficult to have to convince people that from northern European countries to come to Argentina. And also, I think that's also partly linked to, for example, the compulsory primary education and the school curriculum. For example, there was a lot of debate about how they should change the school curriculum because of that problem, because they needed to get people, more interested in doing different kinds of jobs rather than going to the liberal professions. So I think that was also something that I came across. And some of also the variables that you, maybe some additional variables which you mentioned, in, for example, seeing where people, when people came in or how long they might stay. I think also one of the difficulties that in some cases they arrived through Uruguay, for example. They would arrive in Montevideo and then go to Argentina. But also, especially after the Ley de Residencia of 1902, and that's also linked to social unrest. A lot of anarchists, a lot of people went back to Uruguay, especially anarchists. That's why one of the main reasons why the Ley de Residencia was passed, because of that political issue there with especially Italian and Spanish. So a lot went to Uruguay in those years after 1902. So that's maybe also one of the variables there in that period. And then I also had one final question. I think if I remember correctly, that you said that it's Italian immigrants from the who went to Argentina were mainly from the north. Okay, and I was wondering, is that throughout the period that you're looking at, or is it like, for example, does that change later? Maybe later on, more also from the south. I'm not sure how if that's sort of more in the earlier stages, 1870s, 80s, and then that pattern changed, or was that throughout the period?
Yeah. The last one, yes. The majority of Italian immigrants from the north is in the early period. They continue all over, but then the south also join. I mean, the south mainly went to United States, but also to Brazil and Argentina. Your second question is people coming and going from Uruguay and Brazil, yes, absolutely. I mean, but before the law of residence as well. I mean, that's why I tend to consider Argentina and Uruguay sometimes as the same labor market, because they were crossing. And with my families, there are a lot of cases of people with one child born in Brazil, the second child born in Argentina, or one child born in Italy or in Spain, then in Brazil, then in Argentina, or in Uruguay and then in Buenos Aires or whatever. So there are a lot of mobility between Brazil, Uruguay and Argentina, and particularly because between Montevideo and Buenos Aires. And your first reflection that the Spanish immigrants were not very entrepreneurial, yes, we are still the same. I mean, if you go now to Spain, it's exactly the same. I mean, people want to be civil servants, lawyers, anything but being entrepreneurs. So maybe it's something, a question of intrinsic of our national character. But yeah, it's like that. I mean, there is no explanation for that. I mean, maybe we love, being secure. But that reminds me that there are few among the economist literature, some studies, for example, saying, well, the number of lawyers in each country is going to tell you a measure of the qualification or the skills of the labor force. The number of lawyers in Latin countries, in Spain, in Portugal, it's amazing. I mean, the number of lawyers tells nothing, because, we have surrounded by lawyers, but maybe it's an historical patterns.
But that was so since the 16th century.
Yeah.
Nikki, if I may, because that came to my mind, I think it's a very good. Sorry,
That's all right.
Roll over my prerogatives. But it might be a way putting together Natalia's and Tom's questions in the way that we define. We tend to assume certain, propensity to become citizen, but we don't discount what are the penalties. And in this issue about being a funcionario or not being a funcionario, or being punished in a demonstration and so on, what was the penalty? Obviously here there wasn't any, presumably, there was no barriers to become a lawyer instead of owning a shop or a workshop. So how was this? Not to answer now, but how was this in the United States? They got you in a sort of in a wrong place, or in a demonstration or a strike and so on. There was an additional penalty for being a foreigner. If there were barriers to become a lawyer for being a foreign national. So we think that I like very much both comments, because I think that is a way to invert what you've been working all along, which is the standard in which this way are seen. Was there any penalty if you were captured in a wrongdoing or in a crime or something for being a foreigner elsewhere? And it's a way to discount the disincentives of becoming a national. Now, Nikki, to you, and we should probably close after that. You have the last question.
Thanks I really enjoyed that, thank you. I was just thinking about literacy, and you said it was a main indicator of human capital, and of course in a way it is, and in some senses it's, at least in quantitative terms, the main thing we've got. But, first of all, of course, as you know, it ranges hugely for what literacy actually means, and I just wondered if you're going to try and draw on qualitative sources to try and tease out much more about what is actually meant by literacy, and particularly that would change, I would imagine, very much over time. And then the second sort of related point is, do you have any access to, a lot of immigrants do well because they have basic practical skills, don't they? So, and particularly in the, again, earlier in the period, and you get one of the reasons anarchism becomes such an important thing is you've got a lot of artisans there. So they have these kind of practical skills which may or may not be linked to literacy. And I just wondered, you said you had some data on occupations. I just wondered if there's some way of sort of bringing all that together and sort of teasing out and making the sort of definition of human capital perhaps a bit richer.
Yeah, that's definitely my next step. Not only they have practical skills, they have what the economists call low specific human capital, and this is something very important. It sounds terrible, say you have low specific human capital, but it's perfect if you are an immigrant, because if you are very, very qualified and you imagine that you are, brain surgery, you cannot emigrate unless you have an hospital to perform your skills. If you have low specific human capital, you are very adaptable. You can work in any trade, and you can adjust easily to a very, at least in the case of Buenos Aires, to a very flexible labor market. I'm not saying that this is an advantage as such. I'm saying that for most of them with, as you say, practical skills or with no very professional definition, Latin American countries offer a great opportunity, to adjust to very flexible labor markets. They can learn by doing. And what I've seen in the occupations, for example, for women, they are not very skilled, of course. You have simmer, iron, how do you say, washer women, things like that. It's not skilled occupations, but they were contributed to the family income, and they had a job that something. I have to think about that, but the question is, how do you define skills? Because it's very difficult when you have a variety of occupations. From the most, outrageous. I didn't know that there was an occupation called fidelero. That's something that made fideos. But yeah, fidelero. How do you consider a fidelero? Is it a skill occupation? Is it not? Maybe you need some skills to do pasta or not.
I think I would say that is a skill, right? That's really the kind of thing I'm thinking of.
Yeah, but imagine, you multiply by thousands of cases, that it's very difficult to put these professions in a global framework of skills. But the point of view is that I'm sure that with the occupations we are going to have a picture much more qualified of this immigrant population and their possibilities of adjustment to the labor market. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I guess that we've been long enough, and thank you very much, Blanca, for
welcome
the talk. Thank you, the audience, for coming, the new people, and we all know new people. It's good to see you guys. And we have in 2 weeks the last meeting with Professor Anthony McFarlane. So we hope to see you there. And for me, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.